Hello everyone, I'm Kevin Kelly. Welcome to my program called See the Future. The future often looks uncertain and sometimes it looks scary, but it is not without its traces and clues. We cannot predict specific products or companies, but we can predict the general direction of technologies. In each episode of this program, I will try to answer an important question and to provide you with a sense of which direction technology is headed. I hope my thoughts on this topic can inspire you in some ways. Thank you. This week, I'd like to talk about black swans. Black swans are the idea of a very improbable event that has a high impact. And the question is, are black swans inevitable? And the answer is yes, they are inevitable. The follow-up question is there anything we can do about them? And the answer is yes, there's a couple things we can do about black swans. So first of all, let me explain a little bit more about what they are. So the future is really not very predictable in many aspects. Most of what will happen tomorrow is exactly the same thing as today. Most of what will happen in a couple of years from now is already happening today. But every once in a while, something that is completely unexpected by anybody will happen. Sometimes those things don't make much difference to the world, but other times they can change the world forever. Those events are called black swans. And the term black swan came from ancient medieval Europe, where all the swans were white, and people used to talk about a black swan as an impossible animal. It was like the unicorn. It was a very rare, never to be seen, impossible creature. It turned out many years later that there were black swans in faraway Australia, and so now the term black swan is seen as something that is understood to be impossible until it happens. And then once it happens, it's considered completely expected. So a black swan is an impossible event that's impossible before it happens and considered completely obvious once it does happen. Black swans in the past, history might have been atomic bomb explosion in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan, which for most of the world was completely unexpected. They couldn't believe that it could ever been done. And then once it happened, it seemed kind of obvious that it would happen someday. In recent history, we have things like the election of Donald Trump in American politics, which was completely considered impossible. And now it seems there were so many things pointing to it that we consider inevitable. So technologically, there are black swans. Culturally, there are black swans. And when we're trying to think about the future, when we're trying to plan about what we're going to make, we want to keep in mind black swans because they have such an impact on what we're doing. We cannot forecast them, but we can expect them in other ways. So one of the standard ways that we divide the world up is something that was made famous by the Department of Defense Rumsfeld, who talked about the ways of understanding what we know and what we don't know as the knowns and the unknowns. So there's a lot of information science has learned about the world, and we call that the known knowns. We have information about what is happening. We kind of know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we know that. So we know what we know. There's no surprises in that at all. And that's the bulk of what happens every day is the known knowns. Then there's another kind of information where there's risk, uncertainty. And we don't know what's going to happen, but we know we don't know what's going to happen. And so lots of things like, say, the who wins the World Cup, or which we know will happen. We know we don't know that, but that uncertainty is known to us. And we have other kind of events, like say whether a plane crashes in the air. Again, we can't predict when that plane will crash, but we know that there will be plane crashes, and when one crashes, we're horrified, but we're not completely surprised because we know that that possibility exists. And that's called the known unknown. There's a third kind of knowledge called the unknowns unknowns. So we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't even know that we don't know. We don't know what the uneventful thing might even be. So the risk is twofold. It's not just that we don't know who's going to win or lose, but we don't even know that there's a game being played. We're not even aware of that general possibility of uncertainty. And that's a much more powerful risk, and that's closer to what a black swan is. So a black swan is really kind of an unknown unknown, meaning that it's so hard to believe that it's not even known that it's a possibility. And that's a very difficult thing to kind of wrap your head around, because we know, in a certain sense, that there's going to be some black swans. So we kind of know that there will be some unknown unknowns. And the question is, well, how do we prepare for those? How do we get ready to make plans for that? And the answer is, in some ways, that we want to move as many unknown unknowns into the known unknowns. And one way to do that is to actually kind of examine those things that seem impossible, what we sometimes call the unthinkables. So we can kind of make a list. We can kind of go through the world, and we can kind of categorize the things that seem to be kind of like impossible. And there are things that are physically impossible, and then there are things that are kind of like culturally impossible or technologically impossible. And so we want to talk about those. And so it's like faster than light travel. That's just not really going to happen at all ever in our lifetime. We don't really have to think about that. But then there are other kinds of impossible things, like could there be a war between North Korea and America, or a nuclear bomb going off in a city? Well, that's an unthinkable that is worth thinking about, because we could imagine some way to get there, even though it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. We can imagine an asteroid striking on a major city. That's kind of closer to known unknown. But we could kind of go through this process of listing impossible things, and then trying to see if we could move them from something that we weren't expecting to what we're expecting, by asking ourselves, well, what would it take to make that thing happen? If we come up with some crazy idea of maybe human clones being born, right? Or a hybrid between a gorilla and a human. Somebody makes a hybrid between a gorilla and a human, and they're born. Nobody's expecting that. It's kind of an unknown unknown, but we could turn it into a known unknown by actually saying, well, what would it take? What would have to happen? What would be the just before technologies or culture that was necessary to make that happen? The exercise that's often very useful is to imagine there is a person from the future coming back from 100 years in the future, or 50 years in the future, and they say, I can tell you for sure that this impossible thing happened. And then you could say, well, what happened just before that? What were the steps that were leading up to it? So if you knew for sure it was going to happen, what would be the necessary things that would have to happen to bring that about? And then you could begin to look at those early steps and say, well, if it happened in the year 2050, then by the year 2020, this would have to be happening. Can we see any evidence around the world that this is happening? So this is one way to kind of take black swans, which are unknown unknowns, and make them known unknowns. You still don't know whether it's going to happen. You're still not sure. It's still high uncertainty, high risk, but they're not that double unknown unknown. They're not a black swan. They're now just sort of highly unlikely, unthinkable. So what I was just doing right now is really part of an exercise we call scenario building. And scenario building is, for my money, that one of the best ways to kind of deal with black swans and the unknown unknowns. And what you're trying to do is not predict the future, which is very hard and almost impossible over a long term, but we're trying to not be surprised by it. Again, we're trying to not remove all the uncertainty, but move things from the being uncertain about our uncertainties, the unknown unknowns, and bring them to known unknowns. Bring them to the point where we can at least consider them and, more importantly, rehearse for them. So the goal in thinking about the future, again, is not to predict what will happen, but to not be surprised by what happens. Because ideally, you would have kind of thought about all the kinds of things that are within the realm of plausibility and possibility, because the one thing we know about the future is that it has to be possible and plausible. It may be unexpected, but it has to be possible. So if we can kind of stake out the corners of what's possible, then we know that the future has to land somewhere in between. And if we can kind of take the two extremes and saying the future has to be in between, then if we have rehearsed for the two extremes, we won't be so surprised by what happens in between. So part of the scenario process is staking out those corners, the absolute extreme version of what could possibly happen, so that whatever does happen is going to be in between those, less extreme, and therefore something we had at least thought about. And the way we think about those is that if we can kind of imagine what the extreme versions would be, we think about, well, what would be the evidence that they're happening now? And more importantly, if we knew for sure that this was going to happen, what would we do to prepare for it? Right? So if we knew that, say, human hybrids were going to be happening within 30 years for sure, what would we do now to prepare for it? If we knew that autonomous driving cars would become 100% of all vehicles in 50 years, what would we do now? If we knew that telepathy, human telepathy, being able to communicate with a computer directly from our mind, if that was really going to be possible in 20 years, what would we do now? How would we get ready for that? And sometimes the answer to multiple different scenarios, we have the same answer. We would do the same thing for more than one version of the future. And if we're doing the same thing for more than one version of the future, that's a very good sign that that's something we should consider doing. Right? So that's the general process, is to let's look at all the possible ways the future could go. And if each one of those was proven true to us as an exercise, we would decide what we would do. And if we're doing the same thing for many versions of the future, then that suggests to us that's a very good thing to do, because you now have prepared for a very large set of what's going to be possible. So this is, in general, the scenario process of trying to rehearse for as many different possible futures, including things that are impossible, implausible, and if there are common responses to multiple different scenarios, that common response is kind of a no-brainer for us. Well, it's like if you're going to have to change your education process in 5 of the 6 different scenarios, then you should do that. If you are going to have to invest into battery technology for 6 of the 10 possible futures, then that suggests that that's a very good thing to do. So this is the exercise, which is, let's imagine the extreme versions. Let's imagine the most impossible thing that's still plausible that we could do and imagine for the future. And then let's rehearse both what kind of evidence we would see if that was happening, and then secondly, what our response would be either as an individual or as a company. And this is the way that we can deal with these black swan events, which are going to happen. So who knows what they are? Even though they are unexpected to us, usually somebody has kind of imagined them, and we want to kind of send our feelers out, our researcher, and try to examine the most implausible thing that could possibly happen and say, well, what if that really did happen? What if there was World War III? What would we do? What would that look like? How might that fall out? How might that start? What happens if there really was a worldwide global population collapse in 30 years? What happens if there was a pandemic? What happens if there was a discovery of fusion? What happened if fusion energy worked and energy became really cheap in 30 years? What would that do? How would our business change? How would we change if energy was suddenly very, very cheap anywhere in the world? And so we would begin to try and construct this in a very systematic way of collecting these unknown unknowns and turning them into known unknowns, and then constructing a system to look at these to see if there were common responses to these different unknown risks. And those common responses would form a core of what our strategy should be. And this general process is a scenario building process, and this general process is how we deal with the inevitable black swans. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate your patience and attention for this episode. I sincerely hope it gives you insight and understanding, and I look forward to discussing the next important question in my next program. Thank you.